Welcome to the Suicide Prevention Show. It's a show because our aim is to be entertaining and to be engaging and to bring you into a world where suicide is a thing of the past, where self-sabotage has been replaced by self-empowerment. That's the world that we inhabit. And to walk us through what that journey might look like, I'd like to welcome into the studio Scott Sargeant. So Scott, would you be willing to see it? Have you could manage, actually, it's not you, I know. We got tech in the background. I think we got some magic happening. There's a camera coming on. Uh-oh. Hey, Scott. There you are. Yes. Yeah. Woohoo! It's magic.
I'm gonna move the shadow. I'm like
Yep. So there you go. You got the, that's okay. That's fine that the shadow is there. We're not worried about shadows. We do shadow boxing here.
Well, I don't know if Katie mentioned, you know, I had a little excitement 10, 15 minutes ago trying to get in ahead of time. My computer won't power on.
Ooh. All right. So for anyone who's listening to this, take a deep breath and don't panic, because you just said the most anxiety producing words in the current age. My computer won't power on.
Well, seriously. And one of my mentors is one of the founders of the Navy SEALs, and they have a saying that 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So in other words, always have a backup. And I'm grateful that my trusty handy dandy tablet is right there ready to go. So the show will go on. It may not be quite as a high production value as my webcam and my microphone, but we will manage.
You know, I'm able to hear you just fine. So people will chat and let us know. I think we are good to go. Scott, I am so grateful that you were able to make time to come on the show today. I just want to tell you that I feel very blessed.
My pleasure.
Let's take people on a journey, because when I was writing up the description of the show, what I was finding myself writing, I was like, oh, wait a minute. How do I explain that we're going to talk about a journey from, Olympic level athlete? You're going to have to talk to us about what you were doing at that level, because I was reading your bio going, oh my goodness, I can only imagine what that event was like to experience. So I want you to take us there. Mm-hmm. And then what happened next? Because you have been on, well, let's face it, you've had an experience that very few people, every level of your life, but we've all had our highs. And maybe we've all had the same journey down to low. And so your willingness to share that story with us is so appreciated.
Absolutely. Well, my pleasure. And I'm honored to be here. So I know you'll probably navigate with a lot more questions, and I'll try to keep pretty focused with so much the ground that I could cover. But yes, I've had a lot of high highs and some very low lows. So, but so I'm a retired aerospace engineer. I got a mechanical engineering degree in college. And one of the things I like to, you talk about sine waves, and, waves go up and down. And in life, this is not a good thing if you're flatlining. So, it's part of the normal experience of life for us is to go up, and if you're at a high, then, enjoy it while you can, because it's good, you're going to get a correction. And when you're at a low, if you don't get too bound up with that, things are one way or another bound to change and hopefully get better. So, tracing back through growing up, I had a real love and passion for sports. I actually grew up with the soccer and baseball as my main events, and I was always a superstar, one of the home run kings and in the playoffs and all-stars and all this time. I was also a really good student. My mother was a high school chemistry teacher. My father was an engineer. I sometimes joke that I grew up with Scientific American Journal on the coffee table and I actually read it. My dad gave me Gray's Anatomy, the medical anatomy textbook, when I was about 10 years old, because as an engineer, he'd been laid off, changes in industries, what have you, and felt like medicine would be a more, stable profession, and was trying to nudge me that way that early on.
Subtle. That was subtle. Parents, we do this to our kids,
Oh yeah, and I was in wanting to relate to a segment of the audience being teens. I was a very kind of mature, very self-aware, growing up, and as a teenager, really perceptive and insightful, and well, not to get too esoteric at this point, but I realized looking back, there were things that I had kind of in my intuitive nature, and that I could even kind of feel and sense energy in ways that I didn't have language to articulate until decades later. But and I never felt bad or weird or awkward about that. It just wasn't something that was in the mainstream of conversation that ever came up. But I wasn't the fastest athlete, but I would get to the ball first because I knew where it was gonna go. And I didn't realize that most people don't know that, or have that awareness. But anyway, I was graduated second in my high school class. I grew up in Orange County and chose UC San Diego because I loved the area. I didn't want to leave Southern California. There in La Jolla, looking out over the ocean. Scripps Institute of Oceanography. I thought if I didn't like engineering, I could always, segue into oceanography or marine biology or what have you. My dad was a bit of an adventurer, quite a bit of an adventurer. So weekends away from engineering in school, we'd go out camping. He was into motorcycling, dune bugging. We were snorkeling and scuba diving and fishing, and he took up hang gliding, was one of his latest things.
Wow.
Yeah, and he actually passed away when I was 13. So I've tended to say I had a very contentious relationship with my father. He wasn't really into my sports. In some ways, I think maybe he felt jealous or just didn't understand it. He wanted to do other things. And at the time, it didn't really bother me that much. It wasn't even really missing that it was missing, because my mom was yelling so hard and loud in the stands. I was embarrassed enough. I'm like, I toned it down, Mom. Like, I didn't need another one literally cheering me. But then, looking back, obviously, what kid wouldn't want to have a father that was celebrating those accomplishments and really into it. And so that's something I recognize, later on looking back. And another big thing is, so he died when I was 13. He was actually motorcycling in Mexico. The story, as I understand it, he basically was on a dirt kind of fire road, took a turn too fast, and went off the side of the road, down a bank. And on top of him, broke his neck. So I'm seeding a few interesting things, maybe meandering somewhat, but I, again, graduated second in my class, very successful. I was Orange County Scholar Athlete, right? I got all these awards, and chose UC San Diego for engineering. They have a very strong engineering program. Fell in love with the location. My freshman year, I'm in the dorm room, literally looking out over the sunset out my dorm room window, and wanting to pursue engineering, thinking that I was choosing from all the available choices. But again, realizing, looking back, that was very heavily influenced by my father's career and my mother as well, focusing toward that math science. So anyway, another thing to note is in high school, I got kind of fed up with the politics of soccer and especially baseball. And I ended up switching gears to track and field. And of all things, I started throwing the shot put, which at first I thought this is the dumbest sport ever. It's like this, the high school boys, is 12 pounds steel ball. You hold it at your shoulder and you heave it as far as you can. And a good throw at that level is maybe 50, 55 feet. And so not nearly as exciting as kicking a soccer ball, 30 yards, or hitting a home run, out of the ballpark, hundreds of feet, right? But it got to a point where it was better than the politics that I was dealing with. So anyway,
the politics in which field was politics at that age?
well, largely baseball. So
Ah,
again, my father wasn't part of the mix. So there were other kids who, had parents that were involved. And so I ended up not playing as much as other people that I really felt that I was better than. And in Little League and growing up before high school, I'd always been a superstar. I was a starter, I was a home run king, what have you. Now I'm sitting on the bench when somebody that I really felt wasn't as good as me was playing because of a political angle, between the coaches and the parents and, those dynamics.
that's a pretty early age to become aware of political drama and the power of politics.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and another thing was that I was a 4.0 student, and in my high school anyway, which I went to a very good both academic and sports school, Los Alamitos High in Orange County. Um, the most of the athletes, especially the baseball players, were all giving high fives if they got their minimum, 2.0 C average, so they'd be eligible to compete in sports. But one things I didn't realize until later, looking back, was that as an athlete, I was playing soccer in the fall, which you would think would be an added benefit, right? Here's a great athlete, he's doing another sport. Well, the other guys that weren't playing other sports were practicing baseball for those 3 months.
Oh.
And so then I came out, and the coach sometimes would give preference to those athletes that had been putting more time in, that had been there longer.
Understanding what matters to the person who's in charge. We call it the ballpark theory inside my training program. Understanding the agenda of the club owner and the rules of the game. It's not a perspective that any child has.
And that's so brilliant. I didn't piece it together till later in life, but one of the greatest lessons of games is learning to play the game by the rules of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And life is like that, and so many endeavors are like that, where it is one big game, and there's rules out on the court, there's external rules that very much behoove and benefit you to learn,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can, first of all, recognize you're playing a game.
That's a really good start. Yeah.
And then when you know that you're playing the game, then you can play the game to the best advantage, and also have a little bit of perspective of not taking things as personally, just realizing you're playing a game and other people are playing a game, and you're all playing a game, with and against each other and what have you. So even right now in this, I'm looking back, like the game Chutes and Ladders, right? You're going along and you're going up and up and up, and then you get you get on the spot, and all of a sudden you get to go up 3 levels, and then you're going on along, and then you land on something else, and woo, there you go down. What a great life metaphor, right? Because there are those things where we find a mentor, we stumble onto an opportunity, we've done our preparation, or we've been, visioning that, and then we're on this escalator that helps us advance really quickly. Or sometimes you're not watching, not paying attention, not aware of the game that's going on, either externally or internally. Because you and I both do a lot of work on the internal game,
Mm-hmm.
right? And all of a sudden that can kind of blow up in your face. So we'll get to some of that in my life experience.
There we go. You go right ahead and take us there. Scott, you have such a story. And your background was that sports came easily to you. What's the problem when you have that kind of natural ability?
Well, I was also really school, I was really gifted at academics. Most of them came easy to me, and the things that I didn't really do, but there was plenty to be good at, that I did. What's the problem with that? 2 things that I can think of off the top of my head. It's a great question. The first is that it probably can tend to narrow your focus a little bit. It's pretty natural to do the things that are fun and easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the degree of acknowledgement and celebration, validation, whatever that I got from other people, teachers, peers, what have you, feels really good. you could even look at it through a lens of addiction.
Ah,
Other,
it's
right?
a whole nother conversation when we're talking about external validation and being addicted to what that feels like.
And this is really good. I like playing with numbers sometimes. And, and now at 51, looking back, instead of being 15,
There you go.
lots of different perspectives on these things. And, but again, I was very, very aware. I think the other thing is that, trying to remember exactly what I said. The first thing is that it can narrow your focus, right? You're not going to adventurous to look outside for other things and explore other things that might not be easy at first because they aren't so natural. You stick with the things that are really, really fun and easy. I think the other thing is that maybe that it is a little bit of a setup for further down the road. Eventually, I don't like this saying that life is hard, but there are hard things in life.
Oh, now there's a quotable. It's not that life is hard, but that there are hard things in life. So, granted, I am so with you there because I agree. It's not that life is hard, but I've had a few hard things in life. So I'll bet everybody listening to this interview will be able to relate to that, Scott. That was lovely. So keep us moving through this journey because right now, I mean, you were up and up and up. Your dad died in a motorcycle accident. Well, you were only 13. And then you were up and up and up through high school, gifted academically, gifted sports-wise, starting to get aware that there's such a thing as, wait a minute, why isn't this working the way that I thought it would? I thought being the most gifted player, I'd get to play, not realizing that the coach would have favoritism towards the people who had actually showed up for early practice in the fall. Yeah. So, I mean, you're getting this education that many of us just are oblivious to. And then what?
Well, so many and then what's. I think quickly worth highlighting with my father, again, this sort of mixed energy. So I literally remember when I got the news that he had died, feeling this intense emotion come up, from my belly and rise up to my solar plexus and underneath my heart. And there was an agony and grief in it, but I just very willfully stuffed it down. I'm like, no, I got to be strong for my mom and my brother.
Ooh.
And there was an element even before that where I kind of was trying to be more mature and more of an adult. And because my dad was kind of playing and goofing up, even doing really daredevil things, motorcycling and hang gliding. If you look at that objectively, it's like, wait a minute, you got a family. Why are you doing these daredevil things? Scuba diving. But so there was this big suppressed grief, right? And then actually a couple years later, when I was getting ready to drive, my mom had kept the car that my father had been driving at the time when he passed. And I'm cleaning it up and I'm getting excited and, getting ready to do my learner's permit. And underneath the floor mats, I found a letter and a picture, turned out to be from a woman that my father had an affair with. Now, I hadn't known that. As far as I knew, my mom and brother didn't know that. I was appalled, how could he? I was raised in the Presbyterian church, so even though I didn't, I say I don't really consciously subscribe to that dogma, but the programming was still there about fidelity, betrayal, sin, all that stuff. So there was real rage, how could he? But I ended up burning the letter and the picture. I swore I could never tell anybody. And literally told myself, I'm going to take this secret to my grave.
That's a heavy duty secret for a 16-year-old to carry for their parent. Wow.
And again, at the time,
it seemed like the best idea at the time. I get that.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, I got this, basically, right? Like, not cool, but okay, whatever. There are plenty of things that my dad had been annoying to me anyway. And I even look back and could see there were ways that I felt bullied. You heard me earlier say I've had a contentious relationship with my father.
Mm-hmm.
Really, literally in the last year, have I realized, as I've been hearing the term bullying in the mental health space and more in our common conversation, I was like, oh, I felt bullied by my father.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't an alcoholic. He didn't beat on me, like, but there were things that he did, and there were ways that it landed for me.
Yes.
So there was actually also an element of relief when he passed away. That again, I also didn't really identify until years later. But anyway, so there's all of that kind of, I'm laying some of the underpinnings because I think it's relevant, and I
Mm-hmm.
think hopefully it's valuable in some ways to some of the potentially younger listeners that might be, listening to or watching this show, to recognize that there's these things that may seem big or small at the time, but they can end up having a bit of a ripple effect. And
We're going to call the core conflict that you felt when your dad passed away as, that's an elephant. Let's just name it. There was two very distinct emotional states that you were dealing with, or actually not dealing with, because you decided you needed to be strong for your family, because that's what 13-year-old boys do in their families, that they've been raised with this model of emotion. And so you had the emotion of grief and loss and the emotion of relief and freedom, and all of it got stuffed.
well, you say elephant, and it wasn't the elephant in the room. It was the elephant that I dug a big, deep hole and buried it down,
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, sometimes when I speak, these are only things that I've really been publicly revealing in the last year to 2 years. I had my TEDx talk 3 years ago where I revealed some of the big secrets I'm going to talk about later. But a third pretty really significant, let's call it elephant, that happened when I was growing up, about the same time as discovering the affair. I had a bit of a confrontation with my mom. And again, I'm a really good kid. I'm an Eagle Scout. We're going to church, all the stuff. I'm a star student, star athlete, don't drink, don't smoke, none of that misbehaving antics. And, but I had some kind of a argument with my mom and kind of a confrontation, and I was mouthing off, and I may have some swear word. And I don't know if I said something to her or, in front of her, but basically she went to slap me upside the head. And I didn't get physically punished. Like maybe my dad swatted me in the butt twice, because I definitely deserved it. Right? So, but I ended up, I was able to react, and I grabbed her arm mid strike, and I caught that, and I was like, don't you ever try to hit me. And, of course I was like shocked and appalled and really hurt, but what came out was anger, and actually a very healthy, like protecting myself from a physical assault. And I could see in my mom's eyes like this, oh shit, because now I've got this kid that's big and strong. And, I imagine that she thought, well, like he could even hurt me. Now I would never, ever, ever, do that to my mom. But that was me protecting myself. And so then we just kind of parted ways. Well, later she came up to my room, was all somber, and said, you've been getting more and more difficult to deal with since your father died. And if you don't shape up, I don't know what else to do except to send you to military school.
Wow.
So that to me was another big one. And what happened there was like, boom, like there was now that wall, that screen, that facade, that no matter how I felt on the inside, it wasn't okay to express or act in anger, and to a degree even feel anger. So that started like significantly again getting suppressed and repressed. And I remember in sports, in high school, recognizing that was an outlet for anger and aggression and frustration. That's a healthy and accepted outlet in our society.
I'm thinking you were kind of like a pressure cooker, and that just turned up the heat.
Yeah, and we're talking before I got my driver's license. All this stuff is before I'm 16.
Wow.
And again, on the surface, I'm the superstar. Everything's great. I'm kind of like a junior Tony Robbins, right? People are looking to me for motivation, inspiration. After my father died, you know, never was there a therapist. It was like, how are you? What's really going on? Like, how are you feeling? It was just like, oh, we're, you know, so glad that your mom, you know, is so lucky to have as strong as, you know, a son as strong as you.
Oh, I'm sure you got praised for being emotionally stoic.
Yep, very much so.
Ugh. I'm weeping inside for a kid that I can so relate to. So emotionally stoic. Not something we want our kids to be. We want them to be emotionally resilient instead. That's what we've learned over the last few decades, is the difference between those two words. Wow. So you're a pressure cooker. What happened?
Well, again, I'm at a really high point when I graduating, top of my class, you know, superstar athlete. You know, it was a 4-time varsity letter between soccer and the shot put. I actually ended up, you know, almost breaking the school record, almost going to the state meet, which is 2 years of, you know, competing in the shot put. And I really enjoyed the team camaraderie with track and field where, you know, we'd be in our individual event disciplines, but we'd all warm up together every day before practice. And then we'd travel together to the meets. And then, you know, there'd be a lot of time to hang out when you weren't in your event. You'd be cheering other people and, pardon me, a really great time. So at UCSD, I went out and, you know, was starting into the engineering curriculum, which was pretty challenging academically. And went out to talk to the track coach about throwing the shot put. Just wanting to, you know, thinking I'd do something to stay, you know, active and competitive or whatever. And he watched me throw and he's like, okay, you know, you got some potential. There's some things, you know, we'll have to work on. By the way, you know, have you ever thought about throwing the hammer? And I'm like, what the hell is that? In my mind's eye, I'm picturing like some kind of a hatchet throw into a tree or something, you know? And he's like, no, it's a 16-pound ball. So the collegiate weight for the shot and the hammer is 16 pounds instead of 12 for high school. 16-pound ball. So if you can imagine a bowling ball at the end of a 4-foot wire.
Whoa.
And then a D-shaped metal handle that you hold on at the end. So you've got a glove on one hand. You're holding this handle with 2 hands. You stand in a 7-foot diameter concrete circle. So if you think about 7 feet's not that big around. Like if basically you lie down and stretch your arms above your head, you're probably more than, well, you're probably about 7 feet. So from there, you start swinging this thing around and then you actually pivot heel toe. So you're like a ballerina.
Ah.
But I say it's like a cross between a ballerina and lumberjack because it's like you're holding a big timber log, again, this bowling ball at the end of the wire. And as you spin and accelerate, the centripetal force causes that effectively to weigh more and more or exert more and more force. So in college, a good throw is about 200 feet. And by the time you're throwing at that distance, that ball is weighing a good like 400 or 500 pounds.
Whoa. Okay.
While you're spinning, you know, like a ballerina, it's going 50, 60 miles an hour by the time you release it.
Okay. So a very precise, very intense sport required a lot of presence.
Very technical. And I got hooked. I loved it right off the bat. I was gifted. Again, it's one of the things that came easily and quickly to me. I think my engineering, you know, analytical mindset and, you know, kind of kinesthetic and spatial awareness, I was able to really understand the technique and all the different complex movements that had to be coordinated. So I excelled really, really quickly. And I really loved the event. I worked my tail off, you know, and summers I would take hammers home and I have video. I had a friend, you know, at a local college and it's getting darker and darker and it's like pitch black and you could just hear the sounds of me grunting and my foot, you know, tapping and grinding on the concrete. Every once in a while there's this big, you know, burst of sparks when I'd hit the ground, you know, with the ball. So I ended up winning the collegiate championship just as a sophomore, my second year in the sport. which is really unheard of. Normally you're not even competing in a national championships till a junior or senior year. And then I won again and broke the all-time record. And the year I graduated from college, mind you, I'm pursuing an engineering degree at a highly competitive school, which was extremely difficult. But I sometimes joke that I majored in hammer throwing and minored in mechanical engineering. Like I invested that much time and energy, training 25 hours a week, 6 days a week, and then going away, for competitions during the school year. So, or during the season. Anyway, the year I graduated, I made it not only to, break that national record, but I ended up qualifying for the Olympic trials. So I went from the proverbial big fish in the little pond to actually I was number 22 overall on the national stage.
Ooh.
So if you can imagine being like the number 22 ranked tennis player or the number 22 ranked baseball player, basketball player, like that's the level that I made it to in this sport. Now, hammer throwing is not nearly as common or well known and celebrated.
And your brain went there, as opposed to celebrating the fact that you're number 22 in the nation in a sport. You have qualified for the Olympic trials. The celebration got buried behind but it's not as good as.
Well, I think that there's some truth to that, and it's a good thing to speak to. But I think, yeah, one of the pitfalls, or what I sometimes refer to the success syndrome of high performers, is oftentimes we are more focused on the gap of where we are to where we want to be versus all that huge ground that we've covered to get to where we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I wasn't celebrating as much the victory and the conquest of like, okay, now I won that game and here's the next game. Now I gotta get into the elite. Like I now gotta make the Olympic team. Like that's the next big challenge or tier. And within just a couple of years, I went from 22 to number 10. I broke into the top 10 nationally. And I'm training with the other top athletes in the country and, on this national stage with now, a viable shot, like seeing within reach this goal of making an Olympic team. I was always inspired by the Olympics growing up, but what I dreamed about was the World Cup or the World Series, in soccer and baseball. I never imagined that I would be, in one of the throwing events of track and field of all things, maybe Bruce Jenner in the decathlon or something like that. But shot put, hammer throw, I didn't even know what hammer throw was.
Yeah.
But here I am having this Olympic, dream now emerge. That's something that now is looking attainable. It's not just like saying I'm going to win the lottery, right? Like there's actually some real reality to it. So I was really invigorated that. But you know how the Olympics, they call it, an amateur athlete?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that pretty much means you don't get paid.
Yeah, that's exactly what it means. The difference between an amateur and a professional in anything is whether or not there's a paycheck.
Absolutely. And so fortunately I had this engineering degree. I went to work full-time as an engineer to support myself because basically, being that amateur athlete, it means you don't get paid. And there wasn't any professional hammer throwing circuit or teams in the US for me to join and be taken care of. If I'd been, number 22 or number 10 in any other professional paying sport in the US, I'd have been doing pretty darn good. That would have been able to full-time focus on that. But so imagine I'm training still 20, 25, 30 hours a week, 11 months out of the year. I'm super focused and passionate about that. There's a huge, physical, mental, emotional load with what I'm investing there. But now I'm working 40, 50, 60 hours a week as an engineer with project deadlines and restrictions. So sometimes I get to go throw at lunchtime. Sometimes I'd literally be in the dark by myself with a flashlight trying to paint fluorescent paint on the ball so I could find it in the dark. But like that's how much I loved it and that's how determined I was, to pursue that. But you talk about the pressure cooker. one of the ways I was able to accomplish that is probably sleeping 5.5 to 6.5 hours of sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So there was an amount of sleep that now at 25 years old, I was able to still do that. But there was a certain amount of sleep deprivation that was accumulating, and a certain amount of stress and what we call overtraining. And here's something that I was actually very aware of those things and thinking that I was managing them. I'm also doing personal development, leadership training, running a nonprofit. Like, I had beyond the full plate, and I'm a superstar. And so,
I can deal with it. I got this.
and frequently people would be like, "Oh my gosh, you're so amazing. You're so inspiring." And I'm like, "Yeah, I worked my butt off. I was good at all these things. Like, I really owned and embodied that." So, here we go. The year before the Olympic Games in Sydney, I'm working with the world record holder as one of my personal coaches. I'm training and competing with the other top athletes and coaches in the US. I'm one of the first athletes at the Olympic Training Center in Southeast San Diego. And instead of going to Oregon and other places, I'm like, hey, you guys should come down here where the weather's great and we got this amazing facility. I actually was the athletes advisory representative for all the men's throwing events. So all the hammer shot, discus, and javelin are the ones that I'm now a representative to USA Track and Field and the US Olympic Committee in my free time.
In all your free seconds, I got this.
And I had this vision for that special woman and life partner. But I had such a high standard for myself in my life. I had a very, very high bar and a high standard for that. I had like a 3-page list of the characteristics and the qualities that I wanted.
We love personal development work.
Right. I had a whole elaborate vision for what that relationship was going to look like. I wrote this amazing poem, that was called My Quest for Love, right? And in that, the emotional richness and tapestry of what I wanted. So 29 years old, and I meet this woman, and she seems to meet up with all these criteria. In fact, all except 2. She had a cat instead of being a dog person. And she was a morning person, and I was definitely a night owl. I thought, okay, well, I could concede those 2 things. And we started dating and really dove into this very, intense, passionate love affair. And she was doing other leadership training and development work too. And so, the standard that she was conducting herself with, and it felt like there was an alignment. This is like someone I was seeing a lifelong partnership with. Mm-hmm. And then things started to kind of get a little erratic. And some things were happening where, for example, like, this seems like a pretty small thing, but I called her one time and I'm like, hey, where you at? She's like, oh, I'm at Starbucks. And I'm like, wait a minute, I thought you didn't drink coffee. And I'm like, oh, well, I'm just this one time. And the level of rigor that I was holding myself to account to with integrity was really, really high in my life and my expectations for myself. And that applied to, who I was going to want to have as a life partner. And so like kind of little things, but then it's getting bigger and then bigger. And so there was essentially an incident that happened where she revealed something about her past that triggered some of that stuff in me. That, again, looking back, I can see that pressure cooker.
Oh, I can imagine something blew your gasket.
It's like Mount St. Helens, right? She came out and knocked the top off of the mountain, and this volcano erupted. And essentially it triggered things in me as if she'd had that affair like my father did. Mm-hmm. Wasn't what happened, but there was things that she had told me about her past and prior to our relationship that, were different than, some of these things that she revealed. Now, interesting side note is, if you look at it objectively, without the just subjective reaction and pain and hurt and all this stuff that it triggered for me, she was actually being courageous and generous and vulnerable and trusting in revealing this thing.
And had no clue that she was sitting on a pressure cooker.
that didn't, yeah, that just, that literally was like the top of the volcano erupted, and this intense emotional pain and agony, and um, it felt like this searing, burning, pain in my chest, but there was nothing physically that I could see, but
Mm-hmm.
emotionally, this runaway freight train. I couldn't like settle my mind. This just thoughts and things were running, running, running. This emotional intensity was just overwhelming and actually just intensifying. I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't able to sleep. After a couple of weeks of not sleeping, I ended up breaking off the relationship. After a month of not sleeping, I was going out of my mind. And I was still working full time as an engineer. My boss noticed, like, oh, what's up? You're not performing at the normal standard. I'm like, yeah, I had a really bad breakup. It's like, oh, I've been there. You just got to focus on work. You got to put it out of your mind. It's not worth it. Same thing with my coach. He knew I wasn't sleeping. There was a point where it's like, well, there's not really any point training until, you get this handled, but like, stop, basically stop feeling sorry for yourself.
They
You
were
know,
telling you what to do, but not how to process emotion.
stop walling in the motion, just like be strong, powerhead,
Yeah.
force through it. So, and I know we've covered a lot of groundwork, and I'll kind of push the accelerator a little bit, because there's like the big reveals that are going to be things that we probably want to unpack more. It's like maybe there's a sequel coming, but sometimes life throws you these big curves and blindsides you. And I ended up waking up in a hospital bed. I looked down and I could see my arms, my legs, my body. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even feel anything. Doctors come in and showing and telling me that I'd broken bones at the base of my neck, badly crushed my spinal cord, was paralyzed from the neck down, and would be a quadriplegic. I'd never walk again. I could expect to spend the rest of my life in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it went from overwhelming, intolerable emotional agony with what I was going through there to just like utter disbelief. And there was a really pivotal conversation with my coach where he called me on the phone about a week into this, and how are you doing? I'm like, what do you mean, how am I doing? This is beyond my worst nightmare. I mean, I'm lying there, I can't move, I can't feel, I don't know, they're saying I'm never going to walk again. And really, in that overwhelm, that anxiety, that, oh my gosh, like, not knowing, and certainly a pretty bleak and grim outlook. And he had the nerve to challenge me. He said, are you going to fight and make yourself well? Or are you going to give up and quit? And I couldn't believe that he would say that. Like, I was so pissed. If I could have, I probably would have hung up the phone, or screamed F you, but this poor Filipino nurse is holding the phone. I didn't want to give her a heart attack. And in this inner rage, I'm fit to be tied. I'd like to think that Olympian in me, and probably the engineering in me, presented with that choice, it seemed clear. Well, I've got to do one of those two. So what came out of my mouth was, I'm going to fight, make myself well. I'm going to recover 100% and walk out of here. And then he said, okay, great. Then that's what we'll do. So he aligned with me on this really preposterous declaration and this bold, defiant vision that I was actually going to walk away from this injury that people don't recover from. And he later told me that the doctors used to yell at him in the hallway that he was giving me false hope. And he said, hey, look, this is what Scott said. I'm just supporting him in what he said he wants to do. So the short version of that story is that I walked out of the hospital on my own power after just 6 weeks. I was able to harness all those mental and physical, distinctions, and the mastery, will, and so much that I developed, and understanding the power of visualizing what you want to have happen, of just speaking it at a time when I couldn't use my body. couldn't do anything else, and really applied, my knowledge to this situation in designing my own recovery program, as opposed to the default, which was kind of making you good at dealing with this tragedy or this loss.
Scott,
Yeah.
how long did it take you to actually speak about that gap between I was overwhelmed, my life was kind of imploding, and I woke up in the hospital? Because there's a gap there.
Well, there was an 18-year gap.
So for 18 years, you didn't talk about what happened between those two very different experiences of life. One is I'm overstressed, I'm overcommitted, my emotional life is a hot mess. I'm not sleeping, I'm not sleeping, I'm not sleeping, I'm not sleeping, I'm not sleeping. And I woke up in the hospital. Fast forward us 18 years. What happened? Because you walked out of that hospital triumphant with a secret. And you've been carrying your dad's secret since you were 16. And you've been carrying the secret of a 13-year-old feeling relief at his father's death since 13. Now you've been carrying this other secret for 18 years. What happened that you opened up and let some light in, let some people in, let the world hear what your truth was?
Well, I may use this metaphor moving forward. It's not just that I had an elephant in a room. I had like a literal elephant graveyard.
Honey, you had a herd of elephants. Yeah. And we got a whole joke in my family about that. So we'll have to do that on a break. But right now, I can get into it. I can give you a really telling glimpse into that, and then I can expand a little bit more, and I could probably do it in about 3 minutes. So 2 weeks after my injury, a week after that one really galvanizing and empowering conversation with my coach, he came to the hospital to visit me. And by then I'd been such a pain in their ass. I said, I'm not a patient, I'm an inpatient. I'm going to walk out of here before you know it. I ended up bringing in my own food, and I got my own room, right? So I wouldn't have any distractions and other things and could focus on what I wanted. And I had him close the door and come over close. And I told him that hadn't been an accident. That going headfirst down the flight of concrete steps in front of my apartment was something that I'd done on purpose. And it was my way of dealing with that intolerable emotional pain and agony that came up, the unending, increasing torture, that physical pain, which now I've learned that neuroscience tells us that physiologically our brain can't tell the difference between physical pain and emotional pain. So it's every bit as valid and every bit as impactful. But I told him that, and he looked right back at me and he said, you can never tell anyone. Let's be stoic.
The same thing I told myself 15 years prior. The same thing I was telling myself when I was in that emotional trauma. And there was, again, the Iceberg Metaphor, maybe 10% of that was what would happen in the relationship that with that woman. Mm-hmm. But there was this 90% of the surface that this got let go that just overtook me.
It's like the genie in the bottle. Once that gasket blew, you were left with an emotional, hot, boiling mess. And no emotional resilience, no emotional support system, because they'd all been shut down and cut off by the decisions that were made at a time you don't even remember about, boys don't have emotion. We man up.
Boys don't cry, all that stuff. Yeah.
I mean, so if there's a victim,
a competitor, you never want to have your opponents know if you're nervous, or not feeling good, or you're injured, right? You can't show any weakness. You got to stay strong. You got to be in control. And I didn't have a framework or even language and words And with my limited perceptions of the mental health field,
Stay
I
as
am,
far away as possible.
oh, and you know, so what I did have is largely through Hollywood and the media, which I challenge you to find me a positive portrayal of any, you know, mental health medical professional. Now that's becoming a little bit more of a cultural conversation, but
Mhm.
by and large, you know, if you go in the movie theater, most of those are you know, sarcastic and poking fun and really not very flattering. So
Yeah.
I literally imagined, and I referenced the movie Terminator, you know, if I told someone what was really going on for me, I would end up locked away in restraints, you know, institutionalized, pumped full of drugs for the rest of my life, like in that literal straitjacket.
Hmm.
Being the warrior that I was, there was no way I was going to turn myself over to that kind of fate. So
And
after almost 2 months of not sleeping a wink, um, I got to that breaking point. It was probably, you know, almost a month before that that I started having those thoughts of killing myself as a way to get out of that emotional pain. I didn't want to kill myself.
right, we don't want to die.
Breaking point where I couldn't take the pain anymore, and that seemed like the best choice I could make at the time to get out of the emotional pain. And the one thing that I believe that I could have done that would have made a difference to help me shift and heal and get out of that would have been to talk to someone and ask for help.
And that's the one thing you've been programmed over your entire life. The two-step, talk to someone, ask for help. Those are the two things that you could not, on a very visceral level, do. So, Scott, the fact that you've broken the silence now is such a service to everyone who's living in a pressure cooker, to anyone who's ever felt alone, because suicide is a lonely space. It happens in silence where there's no one else around to talk to. And your willingness to tell this story, to allow other people to come into this world with you, to experience life through your eyes, is such an amazing gift that you are giving to all of us. And I just want to say thank you.
Mm.
And yes, we're going to have part two, because we now have this other open loop of the 18 years and what that was like for you recovering, setting another new world record of walking out of a hospital in 6 weeks when they had told you that was never going to happen. It was not possible. Yeah. And then we have this 18 years that, my guess is, you were building up pressure again because you had another secret on top of a secret on top of a secret. And it's my story. And, you know, the pressure cooker that I lived through is the mother of a teen suicide attempt survivor, and all of the things that kept that pressed down. And so I want to give you one kudos. You were only 18 years. I mean, that's, you know, there are people who literally are suffering in silence. And your willingness to share this journey and to break the silence is nothing short of, you are our hero. So you're going to get an invitation. You're going to, you'll be part of our journey going forward with the movement, because you are an you are an inspiration, an inspiring person, a very inspiring person, because of your willingness to break the silence. It's not that you're inspiring because you tried to end your life and threw yourself down a flight of concrete stairs. That's not the story. The story is that in one moment, you decided something other than the programming that you had had your whole life. And you said, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense anymore. I'm going to share. And I just want to say thank you for being willing to do that, and for being willing to come back and tell us the rest of the story. We might have to interview you and put this out as a special event. And so my people will reach out to your people, meaning I'll send you a link, get on my calendar. Let's get it done.
Be able to share that in any way that makes a difference for other people. And you know, one of the things that I say, I think one of my two real keys that I want to leave people with. One is that I very much believe if it could happen to me, it could happen to anybody. You know, you never know what's gonna be that thing that triggers that thing inside of us. And you know, sometimes the most courageous thing is just to tell the truth, to ask for help, and to stop suffering in silence.
Yeah, that's the biggie. So tell the truth, stop suffering in silence, ask for help. There we go. 3 keys for living in a state of relaxation and joy. So, Scott, thank you.
My pleasure and my honor. Thank you for having me today.